Small Favors, a short story by Dustin, Eppers. It started with blackberries. Her mother had given her blackberries. She took them from the freezer and kept them in small sandwich bags when they weren't in season. Caroline liked the black fruit more than any other. Normally, her mother thawed them before handing them to her daughter, but this time, she didn't. The bag was opened, and a hand thrust inside, grabbing the frozen fruit and placed into a small cup. Her father asked her to go outside and play. Her father didn't want Caroline to hear. He never wanted Caroline to hear. The rear foyer of the house always seemed especially long to her when her father told her to go outside and play, and it was particularly quiet during the time where Caroline had to lace up her boots, a quiet that was forced and impatient. He would remind her to put on her red coat and stocking cap to keep her warm because of the chill and the wind. The colors of both matched her hair. The door creaked loudly, and when she closed it behind her, stepping outside, she could hear the voices of her parents, voices that sounded like her parents, only much louder, angrier, and much unhappier. Not the voices of parents that attended her school plays where they would cheer for her as she would transform into the bee and fly across the stage, just as a real bee might with the flight of the bumblebee playing from the auditorium sound system. Caroline sat on the steps of the back porch, an old house with an old growth forest for a backyard. Caroline loved that forest. She was never really permitted to go too far into it, though. "Never past the old stump if you're alone," her father would tell her. "You're too far from the house after the stump. If you can't see the windows, you've gone too far, and you need to come back," he would tell her. The house, generational, being given to family over the years, and it showed its age in its old bones, darker corners, and with the long planks of wood warped another quarter-inch every summer in the heat and dank humidity. This time of year, however, the air was crisp, and it came with an edge that had yet to be sharpened by the frigid cold. A smell lingered in the air, a smell that Caroline was affectionate towards, the aroma of wood burning in the early season from farther down the road, the closest neighbors lighting the first of the weathered firewood that came from fallen trees near their home. Those neighbors, even though they lived down the road, always had a smell of oak and pine coming from their fireplace, even in this early autumn evening. The young girl continued to sit on the porch waiting for her blackberries to thaw enough to enjoy them. She wanted very much to enjoy them despite her current situation. Too frozen of fruit and they hurt her teeth. Thawed completely and the fruit didn't last long enough for her. Waiting was something she was forced to do. It was a conundrum that she faced many late afternoons, and Caroline didn't like waiting. Her father had laughingly told her many times that patience was a virtue God had not granted her, but seemingly had given it to him in spades as he looked at her mother. Looking over her shoulder back through the large stained glass window that was more than half of the door, Caroline could see shadows move across the room at the end of the hallway on the other side. Arms wildly pantomimed some nearly forgotten atrocity. The voices inside were louder now, reaching her own ears. Voices that her father tried to convince her to ignore. She picked and squeezed and then threw one of the blackberries from the container and watched it land in the dead grass of the backyard. A moment later, a small, darkly colored rabbit, looking fairly malnourished, hopped to the fruit and sniffed at it, its nose twitching from side to side in an attempt to establish if the treat was ripe enough to eat. Hungry, the rabbit devoured the blackberry and stared at the girl who had provided it. Caroline picked and tossed another, larger blackberry from the container, and it landed near the animal. She watched as its eyes grew wider, as if suddenly surprised that it would not go hungry. The rabbit devoured the piece of fruit faster than the first. "You look hungry," she said to the rabbit standing. "You look hungry," she said to the rabbit standing. Her movement startled the animal, its ears pointing straight up, alert, nervous, and anxious. The ears moved in a pattern not unlike some radar device that Caroline had seen in movies. The rabbit was scared, and it listened. In shorter time than it took to snap a finger, the animal leapt, ran in a circle, and darted towards the forest, leaving Caroline to watch as it ran almost from her view. Like the rabbit, Caroline leapt from the porch and followed as it ran towards the thick growth of trees. The late afternoon sun had no place in the forest as she stepped over the imaginary line that separated her from her home and that of the forest. The light was immediately more subdued under the canopy of trees despite the lack of leaves on them. She noticed on her face and fingers how much colder it was. She watched her breath leave her body as she exhaled, while following the rabbit, which moved faster than she had thought possible, especially considering how thin and hungry it looked. The animal darted sharply, and within seconds Caroline had lost it. Silence and her own blood pumping in her ear was all she could hear while she turned in a circle, still looking for the small brown animal that had enjoyed blackberries with her. Leaves crunched under her feet as she stepped, with an occasional snap from a small and hidden branch. As she continued to look for the rabbit, Caroline realized that she had gone farther into the forest than she had intended. She could no longer see the tall windows of her home, nor could she see the roof of the house. She had passed the stump her father had always told her not to go past. Leaves fell from trees, but there was no sound where she stood. The whistle of the wind seemed to have no ability to play itself in the clearing Caroline stood in. Deciding that it would be better to trace her own steps, Caroline told herself that home wasn't too far away. She convinced herself of it, and she continued to turn in circles, searching for something that seemed remotely familiar. A tree or a branch, perhaps another boulder she had passed. And there was nothing. She was sure that she had been following the rabbit in a straight line. The two of them had never stepped off of the thin path that they entered for the large clearing. She turned only to leave. The rabbit had won and was able to escape her. She decided that when she returned home, she would leave blackberries at the edge of the forest. Perhaps she would see the rabbit again when her father told her to go outside. As she turned to retrace her steps, Caroline heard the cracking sound of leaves. Something burrowing under leaves, to be exact. Caroline had heard the sound dozens of times in the attic when leaves would blow in from the open window and the mice would use them to build nests. Crouching towards the ground, she watched a pile of leaves move in a jerking manner from below. A moment later, the thin, wide-eyed rabbit poked its head up through the dried leaves, stared at her for a moment, and then bolted across the clearing. Caroline followed the animal across and into another part of the dense forest, hopping just fast enough and far enough away that she forced herself to run a little faster, to keep up with as best as she could, until the rabbit stopped in front of an old, withered and worn tree. A tree that, while its enormity far surpassed that of any other tree in the forest, it was a tree that stood alone, as though no other tree had grown around it. The clearing was circular, with the forest becoming dense again on the other side. Old and blacked by fire, with long claw-like wounds etched into its old trunk. Swollen burls deformed the tree even more where it stood, as it stretched taller upward than any other trees nearby. Malformed, nearly without leaves, even for the autumn evening, Caroline looked upward and saw branches stretching their way towards the darkening sky like fingers reaching to grasp the stars beyond. Faint trails of falling stars streaked the early evening sky. Looking away and back at the tree, a burned-out hollow stared back at her where her own eyes rested on the trunk of the tree. Both she and the rabbit could hear the wind echoing through its hollowed-out body. The rabbit sat perfectly still, its eyes fixated on the girl while its nose, small and pink, twitched in the cold air, sniffing her as if to try and judge her intent, while the long, delicate whiskers moved up and down. Its ears crooked at one side, listening for anything else that might be nearby. She took 2 steps towards her new friend and placed a small container of blackberries in front of the rabbit. "I'm not going to hurt you," Caroline said, smiling. As though understanding and contemplating her words, the rabbit cautiously hopped to the container, paused, and then began to nibble on what was offered, stopping every few moments to make sure the girl was standing there and not moving towards it more. The smile on Caroline's face quickly changed from playfulness to surprise as an enormous and blackened hand that resembled thick branches, with smaller branches intertwined throughout, reached from the dark confines of the tree and moved towards the rabbit slowly. There was a part of her that wanted to scream out of fright, and another part of her that would not permit the action. Caroline tensed and stayed silent, feeling as though all the blood had drained from her body. For a moment, she was lightheaded, and her only reflexive ability was to move her hand and arm, raising them to point at what came towards both her and the rabbit. Long fingers with blackened, broken fingernails that looked sharp enough to cut through her father's car stretched above and over the rabbit, dwarfing the animal completely. In a movement that was faster than Caroline could even comprehend, the branch hand snatched up the rabbit. Caroline fell on her backside into the leaves, out of both shock and fright. She could hear the sounds of the rabbit, scared and begging for help, in loud, short squeaks that were made. The hand quickly disappeared into the dark void, and the rabbit no longer made any sound that Caroline could hear. The clearing was silent, except for Caroline's heavy breathing, and that too faded after several long seconds. She stood. She didn't want to look at the tree or the dark void that the hand had extended from. She wanted to go home. She wanted to run. She could hear her father calling her name in the far distance. She left the tree and the clearing behind her and had hoped that she would never see it again, and hoped that the sound of the small rabbit would be forgotten before she fell asleep and as she stepped onto her porch of her home and into the safe arms of her father. Once the girl could no longer be seen, the hand slowly extended from the dark once more and gently scooped up the container of blackberries that had been left. A few days later, Caroline was forced out of the house and onto the porch once more, wearing the same red coat and same red stocking as she held another container of blackberries. The blackberries were not as frozen this time. She had been scolded for losing the container when she came home. She tried to explain how she lost it, but her mother refused to listen, her explanation falling on deaf ears. Caroline reached up and rubbed her cheek. Her skin was still tender where her mother had slapped her. Penalty for what her mother called lying. Her father had shouted at her mother, and then there was silence as her father asked Caroline outside where she would again sit and wait on the porch. Just like then, she sat there, a container of fruit in her hand, once again staring at the forest. The image of the hand played over in her mind each night since seeing it. Stepping off the porch, Caroline could feel her feet taking her inside that clearing once again. Focused on watching the ground more than anything else, Caroline didn't even notice when she passed the old stump that her father told her never to pass. More steps followed, and Caroline finally came to the tree that was twisted and deformed, appearing as though the ground had never loved it enough to allow water to seep into its thirsty roots, as though it never received enough light from the sun like many of the other trees, but instead growing out of malice and contempt for the life around it. The blackened and cracked bark of the tree was aged and gave the appearance that it, too, looked at her with contempt and indifference. The large opening stared back at her just as uninviting as it had been a few days previous. Now, however, she had stolen her father's flashlight off of the shelf next to her coat, and she pressed the large red button powering on the light and shot the beam into the tree. The wind howled through the opening, laughing back at her. The light could not penetrate the dark. It was as though Caroline watched the unlit area gorge itself on the light. After a long moment, the light flickered and dimmed, the batteries dying. Hitting the flashlight and pushing the buttons multiple times did nothing to bring the light back, and finally, without applause, the light died. Reluctantly, the girl stepped towards the tree, but could no longer hear the sound of dead leaves crunch beneath her feet. Although a breeze tickled the skin on her face, no sound could be heard in the air. Birds refused to sing, and the animals of the forest were also silent. As Caroline stood away from the opening of the tree trunk, she tossed the container of blackberries onto the ground, stepped back, and waited. She could feel a sense of fright overwhelm her, but at the same time she rationalized to herself that her mind must have been playing tricks on her. Another part of her screamed internally, telling her to run. This part of her was terrified and wanted to hide under her bed or in the closet of her room, while the tiniest bit of her simply hoped. In deep silence, time seems to pass eternally. Caroline brushed at her cheek as if brushing away the remembrance of pain. The silence continued until the thick, branch-like fingers slowly exited from the confines of the tree and moved outwards towards where she stood. Frightened, Caroline trembled, but steadied herself. The encroaching hand moved slowly like a snake would move towards its prey before attacking. Taking a few small steps backwards, She watched the hand move closer to the fruit, stretching itself from the confines of the tree. The hand stopped as it approached the berries that had been dropped onto the ground. With a wary slowness, the hand picked up the fruit in one grab and swiftly reverted to its black hole with such force that it made Caroline stagger backwards. She smiled then, and in smiling she no longer felt the sting or pain of being struck by her mother. Turning, she left the tree and the clearing, only turning back to look at it once. "See you next time," the girl shouted. Caroline then ran back home, not caring if she would be yelled at by a mother that no longer loved her. She made a strange new friend, and one that she would keep secret. Seasons change, and from time to time doors that were open shut themselves with a silent click. As the snow began to melt, Caroline found her offerings of fruit were no longer accepted. For weeks she had been offering blackberries, apples, and pears to the hand that was made of thick branches that stretched from within the tree. A small pile of decayed fruit sat in front of the tree that gave off a different kind of cold than before. It was now empty. It was void of everything Caroline had come to know about it. Whenever her father asked her to step outside so that her mother could discuss something, every time that Caroline had a bruise on her arm from her mother grabbing her too tightly in anger, or whenever her face stung from being struck, she would silently and slowly put her arms through her coat, button herself up, place the red stocking cap tightly over her red hair, and step outside onto the porch. For long moments she would stare into the forest, and then step onto the trail that wound its way to the tree that had become her friend. After every offering, each bruise would disappear. Each flushed and stinging area on her skin would be cooled and return to normal. Caroline didn't know how it happened. She simply knew that it did happen. Except today. Today was different. As the warm beams of sunlight penetrated the clearing and slowly melted the snow, Caroline's friend was absent even after the offering of fruit had been given. The sting on her face did not diminish this time. The bruise that formed on the back of her neck from being grabbed by her mother throbbed with each passing second. The bruise would be there tomorrow, she was sure of it. As time moved closer to when she would go to bed, Caroline knew that she would gently rub the pained area and stare wide-eyed at the wall, hoping for sleep to forget the misgivings of the day. Yet today she could hear birds singing their songs in the distance, and her eyes even caught a small rabbit as it hopped precariously close to the opening of the tree. Nothing happened. Standing, Caroline inched closer to the tree and peered inside the dark opening. No longer was it ominous and filled with dread. It simply was nothing more than a hollowed-out tree bursting with dew-riddled spiderwebs and old leaves. Several cocoons littered low-hanging branches, no doubt homes for the changing caterpillar, as the warm days approached, and everything started over again. Saddened, Caroline turned her back on the tree and began the long tread back to her home, leaving the pile of fruit on the early spring ground. As spring progressed, a rebirth came over the forest. Flowers bloomed and life opened itself to the world, and a calm settled over the house that Caroline lived in. A calm that was welcomed and seemed to make the days spent inside the home just as warm as the world outside. Much like the forest, a feeling of rebirth claimed each room, and a deeper declaration of love was proclaimed and reverberated against the walls. Misspoke words were forgotten and forgiven once again. Playing and laughter came with long summer days, of hide-and-seek and lunches on the deck, long days of lounging with backs against the trees as Caroline's father read to both her and her mother, tales of pirates lost at sea, fantastic adventures, heartbreaking love told by the ever-playful character of Puck. Picnics were had under the warm sun where lemonade would flow continuously. Afterwards, evenings filled with fireflies that were chased in cooler shadows. Their lights flickered and flashed excitedly until languishing with the resolution of being caught and placed within mason jars. Those fireflies were the prizes for the evenings of good, and were released on the porch and into the dark as the day came to a complete end. There were memories here, scattered scenes intersecting with the bad that would belong to the rest of remembered moments. Warmer and later summer evenings on large blankets staring at stars that twinkled in the far distance, finding shapes in the bulbous evening clouds as they quickly passed in front of the brightly lit moon. The heat amplified feelings too, both good and bad, and in the quiet anxiousness of the warmth, the forgotten tensions were remembered as the days tapered until the heat finally broke the last of everything, and the house was filled once again with aftershocks of words that had laid dormant from even older arguments that solidified the foundations of new ones. These moments slid into early autumn. The sting of remembrance was felt upon small faces with tears that never wanted to embrace the reality of the situation. When the chill in the air could be seen with a nervous breath, Caroline found herself once again standing in front of the old tree instead of on the porch, or inside where the fire burned low and warm in the hearth. "I brought you an apple," Caroline remarked, hoping whatever lived inside the tree had returned. "It's not the same as the blackberries, but..." She paused. Her mother hadn't picked any berries during the later summer days, and the freezer was empty of the fruit. A tear fell from the underside of her eye and down the smooth red cheek of her face, landing on the apple that shared a coloring between crimson and gold. "I thought maybe you would like it," she said as the tear trailed down the side of the apple and touched inside of her hand. Her hand throbbed in the cold and had already started to turn a different shade of purple, different than the other bruises that had been left on her body numerous evenings before. Caroline had reached across the table at dinner and knocked over her mother's favorite vase by accident, inciting her anger. Silent rage was the worst type that Caroline knew of. Without saying a word, her mother reached out faster than she could react and grabbed her small hand. Her mother squeezed until Caroline was forced to acknowledge that it was not okay to touch things that were not hers. Her father pleading for her mother to release the small hand. "It is not okay to touch things that aren't mine," she had repeated 3 times before the iron clasp of her mother's grip released its hold. Each time the words took longer to say because her mother squeezed more and more tightly. Caroline was unsure if the pain was now because of the sting of the cold, or that her eyes flooded with tears that forced her to close them. As she held her eyes shut tight, she wished for everything to go away. She wished that she could be someplace else, anywhere but here, and anywhere away from the voices of her parents. When she opened her eyes again, the enormous, near-skeletal hand made from tree branches stretched unnaturally from the dark opening of the tree until it hovered over the small favor she brought it. In a moment, a shadow crept over Caroline. Looking up, she could see a silhouette, an outline of a gigantic thing that stood before her. The hand that hovered over the fruit turned over and rested beneath her own and opened. It was not fright that kept her stare with the creature, but more wonder as she opened her hand, dropping the apple. The large branch-like claw hand caught the small fruit and placed her offering into the tattered robes that had adorned its form. As Caroline's eyes adjusted to the shadow over her, she could see holes across the fabric that had been worn by time, eaten by insects, and torn from its own claw-like fingertips. A litany of insects scurried through tears and rips, attempting to avoid the small amount of sunlight that they were now bathed in. Caroline could see the insides of the creature that stood in front of her. Much like the tree, the thing was hollow, with a number of broken branches that seemed to serve as a makeshift ribcage. As with the tree trunk, the creature was hollow and filled with silver cobwebs, and littered with old dirt. The autumn breeze touched them both. The temperature around the two dropped, and Caroline shivered quickly and slightly exhaled in surprise. Her breath was much more pronounced, and the breath of the creature in front of her broke the stillness between them. Hollow eyes looked down at her from an elongated and pale animal-like skull. Teeth were missing from its mouth, and several winged insects buzzed loudly nearby. The hollows of its eyes would make anyone else look away uncomfortably, but Caroline stared back, almost indignant. To her, they were as dark as sackcloth, but filled with a sense of welcoming she did not feel when the cold intruded into her life. Resembling a horse, the skull tilted towards her. Horns arced from where eyebrows would have been, if there had been skin on it, and pulled back across the top of the skull in a uniform position, splitting and making a ridge across the forehead. The horns continued to curve in on themselves under where ears might have once been if the creature had been human. Thick globules of darkened sap drooled from inside the lower jawline, staining the fabric that covered its body. Its legs flexed wide like trunks of the forest, and had skin that was decayed, rotted, and patched with old torn fur. Its knees pointing painfully, facing the opposite direction, much like a flamingo. Breathing heavily, it continued to stare at her, and Caroline continued to return her own stare. Stepping forward, its blackened and cracked hooves stomped into the dead leaves beneath, breaking them and scattering the dirt. As one of the hooves stepped towards her, Caroline thought she could almost hear a slight hiss echo across the ground. Its other hand raised towards the girl. This was the only time she flinched in its presence. She looked away as though she were to be slapped like her mother did so very often. When the strike did not come, Caroline cautiously peered back at the hand. It continued to hover near her face. Gently, the thing wiped away the tear line that had formed on her cheek. Her face felt warm, and the sting of being struck vanished. The hand moved to touch her own hand, and this time, Caroline did not flinch, but lifted her palm towards the creature. As gently as it touched her face, the creature touched her hand, and it pulsated for a moment. A stark feeling of cold raced through her hand, leaving quickly, being replaced by warmth. A warmth that made her feel as though she were standing in front of the fire, her hand stretched towards the flames. She felt the pain leave her body and watched as the bruising faded completely. The fresh coloring of purple that crisscrossed her skin and wrist were no more. She smiled. The creature looked down at her with the black coagulating fluid dripping from its jaw and onto the fabric of its robe and onto the ground near its hooves. Caroline couldn't be sure if this thing was smiling at her or not. The jaw of the skull was motionless and slightly ajar, giving the appearance that it was open. She liked to believe that the thing was smiling at her as she continued to hold its hand. A short distance away and from behind her, Caroline heard the faint sound of a crack as a hidden branch snapped under the weight of a foot. "Caroline!" a voice called out, stretching her name. Startled, the girl spun on her heel to see her father standing several feet from the clearing. "Caroline? Didn't I tell you not to go past the old stump? You could get lost," he said, an inflection of worry collecting in his throat as he closed the distance between them. "What are you doing?" he asked, stepping past all the other trees and into the clearing. Caroline stammered for a moment, unsure on how to explain. "I was talking with my friend," she finally admitted. "What friend?" her father asked, looking at the clearing. A small boy stepped out from behind Caroline. His skin appeared hollow but smooth and pale, in a way that one would think the boy had never had the sunlight touch his face, and his hair was unnaturally dark, almost malignant. The boy that seemed to simply appear from behind Caroline startled him as he stepped closer to his daughter. Caroline felt a little more at ease as the hand of the boy entwined into her own. "My friend," Caroline confidently repeated. Her father looked at the boy, who couldn't be much more than Caroline's age, stand there wearing a similar coat and stocking hat to that of his daughter, the same style that Caroline wore, only much, much darker in color. "You live around here, don't you?" her father implied rather than asked. Images of the boy suddenly filled his mind. A boy whose face was blank but suddenly resembled the boy in front of him. A boy that must have been seen by his own eyes before. He was sure of it. He convinced himself that he had seen this boy from what his memory was telling him. Sure that the boy had been on the back porch before with Caroline, sharing fruit. He was sure of it, even though the image was a lie. The boy nodded and pointed towards the direction of the tree. Caroline's father simply took this to be an indication of the boy's home being somewhere nearby in the direction that he had pointed. "You are the boy Caroline has mentioned she shares the fruit with," her father repeated from the image in his head, snapping his fingers, suddenly remembering. The boy nodded his head. He tried to smile slightly, but it was difficult. There was a long pause as the boy continued to hold Caroline's hand. Smiling at the two of them, Caroline's father finally stepped closer to his daughter and stretched his own hand towards her. Taking it, she immediately noticed how warm it was. A feeling of home could be felt. At the same time, Caroline released the hand of the boy reluctantly and felt the growing sensation of safety leaving her fingertips. "We should be getting home," her father stated. "It's getting late. Tell your friend you'll see him tomorrow." Caroline turned back to look at the boy, but he had disappeared. She waved instead at the spot where he had been standing, and then at the tree. Facing forward, she went home hand in hand with her father, and happy in the knowledge that she finally had a friend. Thank you for listening to Small Favors by Dustin Eppers.